Hi, we're doing an oral history for the Town of Hyde Park Historical Society with Dave Ray. It's May 22nd, and I want to thank you, Dave, for doing this for us. It was very nice of you.
You're very welcome. I'm always bugging people to do theirs, so I figured I'd
There
better
you
do
go.
mine.
There you go. Thank you, John, for videotaping.
Yeah, I hope it comes out.
Oh, it will.
I might have to do
He
another
does a
take.
good job. Okay. You've been a resident of Hyde Park all your life, right?
Well, I was born in Hudson, New York, they tell me, in Hudson City Hospital, December 3rd, 1941, which is 4 days before Pearl Harbor. My mother was a nurse there. She went through training there and got her RN up there and met my father in Hudson. However, my siblings grew up in Hudson. I grew up in Hyde Park because they moved here when I was a baby. And the only town I've ever known is Hyde Park. So Brud Golden will still call me a carpetbagger, but I've been here over 70 years, so I think I'm a Hyde. But the only town I've ever known is Hyde Park.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
I had, they're all deceased now. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. Charlotte Ray was my sister, and she married Joe Malloy, the pharmacist. They had a bunch of kids, all in Malloy, so I'm related to them. My oldest brother was Charles Ryan Ray, and he married a Hyde Park girl, went into the service in the Korean War, and became a jet pilot on the Sabre jet, the original jet, I guess, the U.S. Air Force had, and served in Korea. My next, he's older than me, he's 8 years older than me, William Ray, went into the U.S. Navy during the Korean War, rather than be drafted, I guess, and he served during the Korean War, and they both, one brother stayed in, Ryan, the pilot, stayed in quite a while, and ended up a full bird colonel when he did retire, and then he went to work for NASA, so he was kind of a techno guy, you know, he was into computers long before everybody else was, so. And those 3 people were a tremendous influence on my life. They were really my heroes. They were all older. They almost treated me like their kid. You know, my oldest brother was 11 years older, my sister 10 years older, and my brother Bill 8 years older than me. So I was the baby, and it was a big gap. I'm born in 1941. I don't think it was probably the best time to have a child, because that was before the war and the Depression was still on. So anyway, I was born in Hudson, and we came right to Hyde Park, and the first house we lived in is now Sweet's Funeral Home, and I don't remember much of that. My first recollection of life is actually the end of World War II. I was sitting on the front porch there at Sweet's, and my mother gave me a big cowbell, and I was ringing because everybody was laughing and joking and running around and shouting, and you know, it was just, I didn't know what it was, but it was fun because everybody was in a great mood. And I remember my dad, I was, I don't know, 3.5 years old, so it's pretty good. It was that big of a deal that I remembered it. We had to go to Poughkeepsie to pick up my sister and some friends of hers. She was down there with Ann Clay and I guess Janet Page, friends of hers in Hyde Park, and they went to the Bardavon to a movie. And so we went to Poughkeepsie, and Poughkeepsie was just as wild. All kinds of yelling. Everybody was just happy. You know, there's no fights or anything. Everybody was just laughing and hollering, and just, that would be VJ Day. They called it later, you know, Victory over Japan, so it had to be in August. I don't remember VE Day. That was in April, I guess. So that's my first recollection. And from there, we picked them up, and she mentioned that my father said, "How did you know the war was over?" And she said, "Well, they put a slip in front of the movie screen announcing it, a piece of paper, and the place just emptied, you know," and that's what happened. So that was my first recollection. And then from there, the first house I remember living in, really, besides that ringing the bell, was down on Curry Lane. My father rented a house from Bob Rose, old-time Hyde Parker. His son Earl Rose was still in the service, so he had an empty house. And we rented that until Earl came home from the war, and then we had to leave, and we moved to River Road, just right down the hill, actually, directly behind the house, to a house that Hermie Plass and his wife owned. old-time Hyde Parkers, and we rented that house for, right until my father died, 1956, so we're talking now, 10 years probably anyway, or more. And then it was Jim Meyer moved into that. It was his son-in-law, and he's an old-time Hyde Parker, married Bernadine Plass. And so that's the house I remember the most. My father died in 1956. He was only 52 years old, and my mother bought the house on South Drive that I'm in right now. So it's been a long time there. But growing up in Hyde Park, I went to Hyde Park Elementary, walked to school. No, I didn't. I'm sorry. We did not walk to school because by then we were living down on River Road, and there was no bus service to, from there to Hyde Park Elementary. And I remember we rode up. One of the mothers, Mrs. Lehan, Mrs. Lehan, is a grandmother of kids around today. A lot of Lehans around, but she would take us up in her car, a bunch of kids, and that was our bus. When I got a little older, I could take my bicycle and push it up River Hill, and then pedal to Hyde Park Elementary. But it was really a small, very small community. It ended at Fuller Lane. If you go Fuller Lane, half the side is the older houses, the other half are like John Golden built, the newer ones. And it ended there, and there was the Rogers estate, but Rogers wasn't there then. He was run by some school. It was called the Roosevelt School, believe it or not, as I remember it. And it was New York City. Somebody in New York had a private school there, and they weren't there too long, but eventually it became Amart Seminary when the Blessed Sacrament Fathers bought it and had a seminary there. So, and they let us use the property as ours. They were really nice to us. So it was a great place to grow up. Then the houses started developing around the Rogers estate. It was just big meadows and wide open, nothing there. And then the roads started to get cut in as Brud Golden and his partners started building houses. They started he told me how much they chipped in to buy that. It wasn't a lot of money in today's money, but then it was hard to get that much. He didn't build all the houses because he had partners, and so they aren't all the same. But it was, and we used to drive down there. My father would take us on rides there.
Those are the houses like Watson Place.
Watson, yeah, all those houses, yeah. After Fuller. Fuller, half of Fuller, and then right on down. Cromwell, Horseshoe Drive, Valley View, they were all put in. I remember them all being put in as dirt roads as a kid. My father would drive us down to the new development, they called it. And it was a big deal. So, and then I noticed at school, at Hyde Park Elementary, there were a lot more students coming in, and I made a lot more friends, and it was exciting. I mean, we got very crowded there. We had double classes. One class had to meet in the hallway for a while. It was kind of funny because just a couple of years ago they had to close the school here because of declining population. So it was really boom time after World War II. That's what I had learned later, where they all came from. And most people went to work for or for companies that helped IBM. That's really what it was. Oh, by the way, my father, how he ended up coming to Hyde Park was he lived in Hudson and he commuted to Poughkeepsie for IBM. He worked for IBM. He had 4 children, or 3 children, one on the way, so he was exempt from the draft because he had so many dependents, I guess. So he wanted to go, but he really couldn't. My mom couldn't raise us, she just couldn't do 4 kids. So he worked at IBM before it was IBM, and I think that's where they made the machine guns and stuff, or weapons, munitions manufacturing corporation is what they called it, I think. And they didn't make computers. So he worked there a while, and then he ended up at Schatz, which is in Poughkeepsie, Schatz Federal Bearing. And once war came, the rations came for the gas. He couldn't get gas to go from Hudson to Poughkeepsie every day. He just couldn't do it. So he'd come through Hyde Park, down and up twice a day. And my father liked to drink a little. He used to stop in Arbuckle's Tavern here, and he got to know the people in Hyde Park. And they'd say, "Hey, I moved to Hyde Park," and I get. Clay's have a house for rent there. The big house is now Sweet's Funeral Home. Jerry Clay and her husband owned that, and we rented, so I'm told, we rented it from them. That's how we ended up in Hyde Park, because he just couldn't get the gas. So that's how my family got to Hyde Park. And as I said, the only town I've ever known. And so then, living down at the river, I got to be friends in school with, I had like four really close friends, three really close friends. One was Dick Wager's brother, Jim Wager. We called him Doogie, because Doogie Wager was always called Doogie even until he died. Bruce McGahey, I think is the Scottish way to pronounce it. And his father and mother met at Roosevelt's. They were servants for the Roosevelt family. And they met there and married. And they had two children. Bruce was my friend, and Doug, a couple years older. And they lived on the estate almost rent-free. It was a courtesy, you know, from the Roosevelts. And then when FDR died and it got turned over to the National Park Service, the rent continued to be very low. I don't know if there was an agreement with the Roosevelts or what, but if you worked there at the National Park Service, you got nice rent. And he lived in a couple of places there. We used to go down to where the horse stable is. There was an apartment up over that. He lived there, and then moved down to what they call the duplex down the road towards the river. There's one on the right-hand side, still there. I don't know if they rent it or not, but and I stayed there many times. And because of that, we were such good friends with Bruce McGahey that Mrs. Roosevelt, of course, was a citizen of Hyde Park, and she lived over east then. She didn't live in the big house. She went over to Valkill. But she was there a lot, and we met her a lot, and talked to her. And she knew Bruce, of course, because she was a baby, you know. And she only knew me by association with him. But it was quite a thrill to talk to her. I didn't know who she was at first, you know. I was too young. But she was just such a wonderful woman to talk to, so down to earth, and really took an interest in you, you know. And as I learned who she was and what she was, and it's interesting because my father was quite the Republican, and as a young child, I remember hearing how that Roosevelt was a communist, and that was a bad word back then. You know, if you were a communist or pinko or something, that was really trouble. And he would use that word all the time, including Harry Truman, who took over. He called him that, and Dean Acheson, his Secretary of State, he called communists. So I thought they were communists. I think and as a young kid, I couldn't figure it out, but, you know, he must be right. And I later figured out that it's not true. My mother told me, well, that's not true. That's what Dad thinks, you know. And I'll never forget the 1948 election because Truman beat Dewey, and everybody in the country, I guess, looking back, was convinced that that Dewey was going to, who lived in Pauling, but, you know, funny, who was going to win the election, and Truman won. So my father said, I can't believe it, I can't believe it. My mother said, well, you better believe it, because we got him for 4 more years. So as I later learned, they were not communists by any means, you know, and they actually fought communism in Korea. So, but it's just how you're brought up, and how you can be influenced so easily by, especially your parents. You know, whatever they say, that's it. And it got me to realize how a young mind can be molded. You know, how did the Nazis become that way? Well, Hitler Youth and all that stuff, and it's, you know, you believe it. So without an education or something, you didn't. Anyway, my education, the great friends I had, I mentioned Bruce, and I mentioned Doogie, and Dick Sweet was the third. He came, I don't know when his dad came up here to open the funeral home, but that's when he came. And it was early, because I have pictures of him in school with him, like 1st or 2nd grade, I don't know what it was. And we kind of, Dick lived here, Doogie was on Kirchner Avenue, Bruce lived on the Roosevelt Estate, and I lived on River Road. And we took our bikes, and we were able to, you know, probably 8 or 9 years old, just scoot around town. And the building we're in right now, actually the old firehouse, was a big hub of activity. The men would talk to you, they'd let you come in and sit on the trucks, and they were good to the kids, you know. They had a dog here in the firehouse called Smokey, and he was just an old, he wasn't too friendly, but he wasn't nasty. He would look for treats or something. But they used to let us sit here and play with the horn. I remember Moses Smith, we called him Mose, used to sit out front on the bench, and he was retired then. And he would chew tobacco and just go, patoo, patoo. So we'd imitate him, and naturally we didn't have tobacco. And I don't want to swear on here, but his favorite word was Jesus Christ. You know, he used to say it all the time. I told my mother, she goes, well, some people do that. She's really not nice to do that. But I thought that's the only words he knew. And it's just, he was making a point. And he'd call you a kid. You go, Jesus Christ, kid, you know. Anyway, so it was just a great place to grow up. And I remember it just as like it was yesterday. The Frosts live over here. Patsy Newman Costello, right down the street here. Doc Locke was here. Dr. Hearst actually lived up over the Arbuckle's Tavern when he first came to town. He was my doc. Dr. Cross was my first doctor, and I think Dr. Hearst went in with him or bought his practice or something. But when he first moved here, without any kids, his wife Claire and Sherm, I later called him Sherm, lived upstairs over Arbuckle's Tavern. And I had to go to the doctor's once when I was young, and Doc Cronk he was pretty old, you know, and he called Dr. Hearst, and he came running across the street, and I remember with his bag, and I was like, wow, looking back at it, just such a small town, you know, and it's like, oh yeah, I probably yelled to him, you know, across the street, I don't know. Used to be able to park on Route 9 here, and it was, I don't know, it was just a nice place. Post office.
I have a question.
Yeah, the library.
Arbuckle's Tavern.
Arbuckle's Tavern, I guess it was originally Zeff's. You know, the old timers call it Zeff's. But the first name I remember was Arbuckle. And the guy's name was Claude Arbuckle. Right down the street here, the road that burned down in the 60s, that's where it was. The town hall was set back a little bit, the wooden building. And row of stores. We had a jewelry store. Rayho's drugstore was on this corner, and then my brother-in-law came to town, Joe Malloy, opened one on the other corner, and then in between there was a coffee shop, a jewelry store, Hyde Park Jewelry, still in business. Nick Kusher, I think it was originally McClellan was the guy's name, but Nick came in there as a young man, and now his daughter Lori still runs Hyde Park Jewelry. And then there was a modern technology, my phone rings. I don't know who it is, but I'll call you later. The coffee shop, the jewelry shop, liquor store. There was Nick Petro at a liquor store there, and I remember Nick was always dressed with a shirt and tie, and I thought he was a real, sorry folks, shut this off. We didn't have these then. I used to think he was really important because he always had a suit and tie, and he owned the liquor store. And my father used to go in there a lot, so I got to know him. And then there was Arbuckle's Tavern, and then there were, I forget, there were a couple of stores downstairs, and then upstairs there were apartments over all that. And on the corner, before Malloy opened, there was Charlie Seddon was his name, owned a little grocery store, and he would deliver. My mother didn't drive, so we lived on, I remember him coming down on River Road, and he'd knock, Charlie here, and, you know, and he'd come in with a bag of groceries and deliver them, and I don't even know if he charged extra for delivery. I don't think he did. But that's where we went. You either went there, or there was a little, where Cranberries is now, was a Grand Union, they called it Superette when I was a kid. It wasn't a supermarket, it was a Superette, but it was Grand Union. And both of my brothers worked there, under a guy by the name of John McComb, I think. I always think John McGraw, but he was a giant manager way back, so I think it was John McComb, and he was an Irish temper. And one day my brother Ryan was working there, and he got a batch of cabbages that he didn't like the looks at, and he started swearing at it, and my brother said, what do you want me to do with it? And he said, throw it out in the GD street. So my brother did, and a couple hours later, John comes back. Where's the cabbage? He says, out on Route 9. What'd you do that? He says, you told me to. So he got even with him. But it was funny. He was nice enough to the customers, but he would just lose his temper. And right down the street for him was Lasher's, Howard Lasher had a meat market. His father did, and I guess Howard took over. And I liked going in there. We used to go in there a lot with my mom. And Charlie Moore or one of the butchers there would give you a slice of bologna. And that was like a treat. You didn't get any bologna from John. But Lasher's always gave you a slice of bologna, and my mother always bought her meat there. Ray Hill had the drugstore where you got your drugs, and that was it. Until my brother-in-law came, and I guess, I don't know how that worked out, but it was funny because when Malloy came here, my sister was going with a fellow in Roosevelt High School. Anyway, I guess he wooed her away or something, but they ended up getting married and buying Ray Hill's house, which is, it's Journey's Inn now, the bed and breakfast. That's not the same house, because the house that they lived in was, I think the superintendent probably of Vanderbilt's, or one of the higher-ups that worked for Vanderbilt's lived there. It was a big house, and they had a tragic fire there in the 60s, and my sister was there, and so the original house is gone. They lost a child in the fire, too, by the way. That was an incredible job that the Hyde Park Fire Department did. They saved everybody. They lost one child, but certainly wasn't their fault. They woke up in the middle of the night choking with smoke, and one of my nephews, Brian, was able to get on a telephone and call for help. And the only reason he could do it, they had what they call a princess phone at the time, and it had a lighted dial. It was the only light in the house because I guess the electricity had burned through or shorted out. I don't know, who knows. He was able to call for help, and the calls at that time, we didn't have 911, but if you called, they would send it into the Roosevelt estate, because there was always a guard on duty there 24 hours a day, and he got the call, and he had a hard time understanding what he said, because he was coughing and choking. He finally got out of him that it was Malloy, and Charlie Kane took the call, an old-timer, and he was a guard there, and he thought it was the drugstore, that was on fire, and my nephew Brian must have said, no, house. Oh, Malloy's house, yeah. So it wasn't too late. Long after that, the phone rang at my house, and that was the call. And it was a tragic night, it really was. But the firemen did a tremendous job going in there, risking their own lives, and just plunging right into that. It was a second story, and got them out on ladders. And Dr. Hurst came, and it was just incredible turnout for the town. It's too bad to hear that the fire department now is really hurting for volunteers. They're down to just a few people, and they really need it. But times have changed so much, They even changed from here. They had to get out of here because these bays weren't big enough to get the trucks in, There was one guy, Dick Hover, he was a professional truck driver, and he could put it in first time. I don't even think he looked. He just back it right in. Everybody else was like back and forth. He had about this much on each side to get that big hook and ladder in. And this was Rescue, and the other side was Eagle. Two different fire departments in the same town. They came together here in the building, and it was like a rivalry between them. They merged before they left here. They did merge when they went down to the new place down by Pinewood Road. But it was there was a rivalry, and it was kind of funny. My father, he would take me here on Sunday mornings a lot after I went to a GHL, and he was always the usher at the 7 o'clock mass. So we were up early, and then we'd come here, and they had a television up on the third floor. I think Eagle had one too, but Rescue had one. And television was really new. Not many people had them. And I'd go up there and watch the Children's Hour or something, live TV. And I thought that was the greatest thing. And then later we'd go down to Arbuckle's and watch it, because he had one. I could watch the baseball games. And I was a little older then, so the Giants and the Dodgers and the Yankees were all in town, and I was a Giant fan because my father was a friend of Wes Western, who was a catcher for the New York Giants, and he worked at Schatz with him in the winter, and that's how they got to know.
Really?
Yeah, and then they drank at Freer's, too. That was another tavern down by where the firehouse is now. And I saw a lot of bars inside, but they were great guys, They always took care of you, and everybody looked out for you in town. It was really nice, but everybody knew your business also. So you didn't have any secrets, And we had a party line, 5 or 6 families on it, and I used to pick it up and listen. My mother would catch me, hang that up, hang it up. I said, it's only the Nichols next door, whatever. But we thought it was fun, and. So it was just such a small town, and I guess everybody must look back and think it was better then, and it was not. I mean, I love this town. I still love it. And when I walk down here, it's just so familiar to me and it's funny because the people who lived in East Park on 9G, I really didn't get to meet them until I went to junior high school, because kindergarten through 6 was right here in the village. Occasionally we'd go over there and play Violet Avenue School an intramural soccer game or something, but you didn't get to know the kids. When we went to Roosevelt High School, it was called Roosevelt High School. It's now Haven Middle School. It was called Roosevelt High School, but it went from grade 7 through 12. So I left Hyde Park Elementary, a 6th grader, and that fall I walked into that big building over there, and there were adults walking all around. They weren't teachers, they were students. They were seniors and juniors in high school, and you mixed all in. But again, the people in the village, it's funny, you used to call them the village people, they would look out for you. They'd know, oh, it's Charlotte's brother. That's Ryan's brother, and they know, all right, come here, I'll show you where to go. So they'd look out for you. And then these Parkers, we called them, we got to know them and became friends. And it was just funny. It just, the Gilberts.
That's me.
The Gilberts at East Park. I didn't know them until, I don't know, Jimmy came to Hyde. I think Jimmy was Hyde Park Elementary. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know about Billy, but Jimmy was. I remember him being there. He's a year or two older than me. Maybe a year. We played soccer together later at Roosevelt. But most of them went to Violet Avenue. It was before Ralph Smith was built. Of course, once the explosion started, I don't know when Ralph Smith was built. It had to be late 50s, maybe, I'm guessing. Yeah, I'm really not sure, but I remember when they built it, there was a big discussion about it. I remember my father going nuts because they were going to put a swimming pool in it. And he said, there's no need for a swimming pool in a school. And it's a real, at the time, it was a real modern school. It was like a prototype. And it still is, and it's too bad, we didn't fight Ralph R. Smith, but we wanted to keep Hyde Park Elementary open, of course, and they wanted to keep Ralph Smith. And the school board had to make a rough decision a couple of years ago, and they had to close the historical, Hyde Park Elementary. But now they're starting to rent it out to different people, so they promised they would keep it active and keep people in there, and they have done that, and I'm very grateful for that. Because of those buildings, Hyde Park Elementary, Violet Avenue School, and now Haviland Middle School are just, they take you go over to Haviland, it takes my breath away. Look at that school. That's a high school? And at the time they called it Roosevelt's Mansion or something, because it was done under his administration. He took care of his hometown. And they're gorgeous buildings, and they've done a great job keeping them up. So, I went, the most time that I remember was not school as much as hanging around in the summer and just doing what you want, to go fishing in the river. I learned to swim in the river, which is crazy when you think about it. And I was forbidden to swim in the river because of polio. It was huge back then, and nobody really was sure, but the river was not very clean back then. Actually, we learned to swim in the stream that goes in by Andrew's property there on Dock Street. It goes under the Vanderbilt Bridge and into the Hudson. It goes underneath the railroad tracks into the river. And on high tide, you had to lay down to get out because you was bumping your head. So we learned to swim there, actually. And then down later at it's called the Little Boat Club. It was, if you go down River Road and go straight, there's the back entrance of Vanderbilt's. It's Dock Street. But it was open at the time, and you could walk to the river, and across the tracks you'd be on the river. I think which property maybe was there. This boat club was there, and it was called the Little Boat Club, and it had to be part of Vanderbilt's originally. But it was abandoned, and these friends of my father's, a bunch of guys, they were like squatters. They just moved in and used it as a boat club, and had boats in it, little boats, like 16-footers, and they had them on racks, and they had them all stored away, and they had a winch to bring them up out of the water and lower them in the water. It was quite a production. But the boathouse itself was like this, literally falling into the river. It did fall in later, but not while I was there. And that's another place we used to go on Sunday morning after church, was the Little Boat Club. And it's the first time I saw Rheingold beer. They were all drinking Rheingold. and they would throw the cans in the river. And the other boat club, Rogers Point, down the road was just, it's the old Rogers boathouse. And a bunch of guys back in 1951, 52 got together and made a club out of it, actually bought the land and made it legal. And they'd sit at Rogers Point and say, oh, the little boat club must be doing good. Here come the Rheingold cans, because if the tide was going down, they didn't sink, they bobbed all the way down. And the funny thing about the little boat club was Elliot Roosevelt lived in town, and he was married to the actress Faye Emerson. She was a Hollywood star, you know. And he lived, I guess he lived over at Valkill, I don't know. And anyway, he used to go to the little boat club. And because the only reason you went there is to drink. And so he liked that, I guess, to get away. So he applied for membership. I mean, there was no such thing, but he applied anyway. And my father, I guess, pretended he was a secretary or something. And he had to call him up and say, gee, Elliot, I'm sorry you were blackballed. He goes, why? What's the matter? He says, well, I guess they didn't want a Roosevelt in here. And it was just a big joke, you know. He called him back later and said, "You're only kidding. You're welcome here anytime." So it was like a getaway. But I had a lot of fun there. And it was after church, you know, after being so holy, going to church, and then down there listening to these guys cussing. And I was a little kid. I came home one day, and after the boat club, and you know, I don't know, before lunch or something, and my dog was there or something, and I called the dog a little bastard, and my mother went crazy. Where did you hear language like that? And I got Ivory soap in my mouth, and I was trying to explain to her that Mr. McClellan says it every other word. So I picked it up pretty easily. But, you know, it was fun anyway. At least my father had a good time, and I had a good time being with him. So, and people would take me out on the boat all the time. The Waggers had a boat, George Brown up here had a boat, and Jim Meyer, and they would just say, want to go for a ride, Dave? Sure. You know, I couldn't swim. No life jackets. Go out on these 16-foot boats with a 25 horsepower Evinrude, and they would fly. Bang! And a big boat would come by, and they'd go right into the waves, and I thought it was great. Fell over, I'd been dead. But today they wouldn't think of doing that. But in those times, it was just a lot of fun.
How old were you then?
10. Before I couldn't swim. And so I learned in that stream down there, and I also up in Carter's Hole, I learned how to swim, which we used to call it. There's a sliding rock up there in Pine Woods in the park, and you know, it's a big rock, and then over to the right there's a swimming hole, and you know, it's
where the cash is.
kind of murky looking, but you know, you could touch and then you could just feel your way. So I learned to swim there, and it worked. Somebody showed me how. I don't know who it was. One of the older guys probably. Don't relax. Yeah, so it worked. But I know I couldn't swim when I went on a river with some of those guys, and you know, I'd been drinking all morning. So I don't know how safe it was, but it was fun. So then I left Hyde Park Elementary, obviously, and started at Roosevelt, and 7th grade, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. And that's when I met the East Parkers, you know. We'd hear about them, but then they became our friends. Yeah, no, and then we became our friends, and it was Hyde Park melded. They would come over, you know, for parades and stuff, but really didn't know them that well. And it was funny how that worked out. Might have worked that way for a long time, I don't know, you know, because you just don't have any contact with East Park that much. It's almost a mile if you walk over, so, and we had stuff right in the village then. So. They had the meat market over there, and we went over there. They had the East Park hotel, I know that. My father went there too. And they used to get around wherever they had those. So, you know, we didn't go on vacation much. Once in a while we would go up to, around Lake Minerva, little lake up there, which we went with the Bradleys, lived up on Sherwood Place, and Margie Bradley actually married Hal Mango, became judge in Hyde Park and attorney, and they went to Minerva, so that's how we ended up going. It's a nice little lake, but we didn't seem to go every year. I don't remember that. We stayed around town mostly. Probably with 4 kids, he couldn't afford it, you know. I don't know. So I went to Roosevelt and went through my junior year there, and my senior year. My father passed away in '56. I would have graduated in '59 out of Roosevelt, but my marks were not good. I did, I goofed off a lot. Is what it was. So they wanted me to go to college, and they said, he's never going to get in with those marks. So they sent me to a boarding school in the Bronx, and I hated it. But they make you get your marks up. It was a Catholic boarding school, and they whack you if you didn't study. So I studied, and I got my marks up, and I was able to get into college. And I wanted to become a pharmacist because I worked in the drugstore in Malloy's there since I was like 10 or 11. And so I went to Fordham. I got into Fordham University and became a pharmacist. And I loved the city. I was a small-town boy going from Hyde Park to live in the Bronx, and then you have Manhattan right there and everything. And I flunked out. I think my third year I flunked out because I was partying too much. And they said, well, we'll take you back on probation. So I figured I better buckle down, and I did. And I got my diploma, and then I passed my boards, and I became a pharmacist. I went to work at Malloy's, but I didn't graduate from Roosevelt, and so I always wanted a Roosevelt diploma. But I always say I'm in that class. Everybody thought I was. They didn't know I left. I'd come home on weekends, and I had a car as I worked at Malloy's, and then I was getting paid because I was old enough to get a salary. They paid me before, but going back on, the first job I had was at Malloy's. Years ago, you used to bring your film into the drugstore, a roll of film, and get it developed, and you get it back a week later or whatever it was. And there was nobody in Hyde Park that developed film, so we used to have to go to Poughkeepsie, and ARAX would do it. There was something called ARAX on Main Street, Upper Main, I think. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so he gave me a job. My job was to go in Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and pick up whatever rolls of film people dropped off. Get on the bus, go to Poughkeepsie, drop them at ARAX, pick up what they had, and then bring them back. And that's how you got your pictures back. And the bus line was Twilight Bus Line. I think originally owned by Elmer von Wagner, but I don't know if he owned it then or not. And you got the bus right out here. And they'd tell you, all right, here we go, get off here, Dave. And I was 10 or 11. And probably kids wouldn't do that today, but didn't think anything. Poughkeepsie was really a nice town then. It was, it was much safer than it is now, and really pretty. And it was before the malls were built, so that's where you went if you had to get something to the clothes or something. You went to Schwartz or Lucky's or Wallace's. And it was fun doing that. And then later, as I got paid, I was able to buy a car. I was 16, and it was Hyde Park Motors across the street here. And by then, Ed McCormick was running it. That was he married Shirley von Wagner, and Ike von Wagner owned the place, so Ed became the manager. It was his father-in-law, and Ike was still around, but my father got mad at him once because during the war you couldn't get a car, and Ike promised my father the first car after the war came in, and so he had this Plymouth, and my father saw it come in, I guess. He went over and he said, oh, CP, they called my father, CP Ray, Clayton Peter. Oh, CP, geez, sorry, that car's going. He said, what do you mean? I just walked it off the truck. He said, well, I had to give it to Doc Hurst. He really needs one bad because his is beat up. He goes on house calls. My father got mad at him. A year later, he went over and bought one from him. So they patched up their differences, whatever it was. But that was funny. So I bought my first car over there from Fritz Brower. He was a salesman over there for McCormick and von Wagner, and he sold me his car that he traded in. It was a 1950 Plymouth, and I had wheels, and I took a bunch of kids around town, and the drinking age back then was 18 years old in New York. So if you were 16, they're going to serve you, more or less. And we used to go to certain bars and party, and I'd be out driving, not thinking much of it. Very lucky some nights. And this car finally died I remember going over Dorsey Lane one night, and the lights went out. Everything went out. It shorted or something. It was pitch dark. I didn't know where I was. I just slowed down, and thank God we didn't hit a tree. But then they came back on. We thought nothing of it and went over. So, and I knew all the police. We didn't have police in Hyde Park at the time. You know, we had state police, and they lived in town. As Walt Dunnigan lived here and up on Sherwood, and the sheriff's patrol. But you know, if you had trouble, and they would, you know, they'd let you go or say get home, you know. And thank God they have the laws now. They're very strict because too many people got killed and maimed in those things, you know, and young kids too. So I didn't take my car to high school because I don't think they allowed it at the time. But I liked taking the bus anyway. And I played sports, Rose. I played soccer and I played baseball. So when you played those, you took the late bus home. And or if you were in detention, you took the late bus home. So most of the time I took the late bus home. It was either sports or detention. For talking. I talked a lot, and I still do. And they would you know, put me on detention, give me a few warnings, and finally send me down to at the time the principal at the junior high was Fred Trani, and I knew him because he lived right on Kirkshire. I knew his kids. I used to go to the house. So he put us on detention. It wasn't a big deal with him there. He'd act like he was stern, but then he'd just wink at me, you know, and it's like it'd be all right. And then we get talking in detention. They said, you know, you're going to be in there for a life or something if you don't shut up. So I just enjoyed Roosevelt very much. Just sad I didn't get a diploma from there, that's all. I got one from Mount St. Michael's in the academy in the Bronx. But because of that, I probably got into school and became a pharmacist. So getting up to pharmacist. So yeah, I went to work at Malloy's, and my wife, I wasn't married yet, knew my wife, Joanne, her maiden name was Sinkier, S-E-N-K-I-E-R, lived on Fuller. One of the first houses Golden built was on Fuller Lane, Fuller and Garden Street. And the house is there now. The Yuckelman boy bought it, and he made it a little bigger. But I noticed driving my bike by there, ooh, you're a pretty girl there. And so we get chatting, and I knew her since she came to Hyde Park. And eventually we married, you know, after I got out of college. And we had 4 children, lived on South Drive, and I have 1 daughter, Susan, and I have 3 sons. Mark, the oldest, is in Florida now. He's a police officer. Sean, the second, he's in California. He's in San Francisco. He's in theatrical production out there. And Patrick, my youngest, just moved back into the house and helping him out a little bit now, and he's doing good. And I was glad that it's nice to have him, you know. I had an empty nest. Oh, my wife passed away like 6 years ago, I guess. So, you know, I was alone, and you get set in your ways after a while. It's nice to have him around, though. Not that we don't have disagreements, but it's good. Yeah, I loved my wife and loved my life, and you know, like any marriage, ups and downs. But I intended to marry her early on, and I did. No one
When were you married?
42 years, I think, when she died. Still be married, I guess. And not that we didn't have ups and downs, we did, but I loved her very much. And her sister married one of the Weggers. He became my brother-in-law. Not Doogie, but his younger brother. Hyde Park was small. Not that we intermarried, but we knew everybody. And then they sent us divorce, but one of their kids is Danny Wenger, and that's my nephew. Through marriage, you know, it's all through marriage, so it's interesting. Am I getting a sip of water? Talking too much.
Okay.
Am I talking enough?
No, you're doing great.
And where are we? I'm in high school, and I got my license. I went to work for Malloy's. We went into partnership on a liquor store, which we opened up right next to the drugstore. Governor Rockefeller. At the time, you could only have so many liquor stores in New York State, and you bought the key. It was like a medallion cab in New York. There were only so many of them, so they were expensive. And the inventory was insignificant compared to the key. Once the guy decided to sell, the key was what. So Rockefeller says, we're going to make more money from the state. We'll open it up. So he said, hey, that'd be good. Put one in next to the drugstore, you know. And it did well. And called it Duchess Liquor, and later sold it to the Murphys, Emmett and Florence Murphy, from down on Curry Lane. But I worked as a pharmacist at Malloy's, and then I'd go in there and maybe relieve them at night or on a weekend. And did that for a while, and then we found a store in Copake, New York, up in Columbia County, that two older guys that were retiring. It was for sale. It looked like a nice store. So Joe and I went in partners on, Joe Malloy and I went in partners on that and ran that for 13 years or something. But the commute was a little long, you know, from about an hour from here to Copake. So we did sell that eventually, and I ended up back at Malloy's, and then it was a time when the Irwin kid, Billy Irwin, was working next door at for Sid Seidelman at the Hyde Park Pharmacy, which was Ray Hill's old pharmacy. He moved down into that row of stores where Sarukas owns now. Two Taste restaurant was in there, and the accounting office and that. And so Sid Seidelman opened up Hyde Park Pharmacy, and Bill Irwin was working for Sid. And he used to come in, and we would swap stuff. You know, you're out of this, you're out of that. We'd loan it to each other. We got along right. And he was such a nice kid and a go-getter that Sid decided to sell the store, retire is what he did, really. So we bought this stock. And I told my brother-in-law, Joe, I said, hire that Irwin kid. He's a real worker, you know. He really is. He's a good worker. He said, oh, yeah, you think he is? I said, I know he is. So he hired him, and the rest is history. You know, he ended up buying the place. Billy and I almost bought it together, but I couldn't work it out with my brother-in-law. So that's okay, you know. It was fine. And he did very well, and Billy just sold it a couple of years ago, and now CVS has it. So there's no more independent, you know, and it's just the way business is going today. The big corporations are running it. And I was elected to the town board 2 years ago here, and I never really thought about running for politics before. They asked me a long time ago, the Republicans, for when I was young, to run. And I didn't at the time. I had, you know, young family, and I was working a lot. And I had 2 stores plus a liquor store. I just didn't have time. But I was flattered, you know, that anybody would even think of me, you know. So just recently, a couple of years ago, a few years back, we had an administration that, boy, it was kind of like, I'd watch them and it would be a little embarrassing. It was just, I didn't like the vibes I was getting from the board, and I thought, oh my God. So then the current supervisor, Aileen Rohr, came in and with a group, and at least they talked to each other. They were calm, you know, and I said, well, it's a little more like it maybe. And then somebody, I think it was an ad in the paper, you know, if anybody was interested in running. And I became a Democrat. I was a Republican, became a Democrat. If anybody was interested in running, I said, gee, I got the time now. I'll throw my name in. And they selected me, and I won. It was a very close election. Don Beath was my opponent. Was very well known, good man, and won by a few votes. So I became a town councilman, and I love it. And people are upset. The way Hyde Park is, the way Hyde Park was and it is now is completely different. You got all the vacant stores and potholes all over the place. And the trouble is, they think the town board can fix it, and we really can't. We can put pressure on property maintenance, stuff like that the corporations have. As a matter of fact, I've been battling just this week with Getty and a couple others. You know, they have that abandoned closed station by Sweet's Funeral. It looks terrible. It's all overgrown. There's a parade coming Monday. And I've talked to corporate, and, you know, oh, yeah, we'll take care of it. Well, they didn't. CVS did. They mowed their lawn yesterday, which I was grateful for. And there's a few others who promised they would. So we're becoming more active in property maintenance. At least start making it look good. We're getting some state grants to do funding to see if the feasibility of a sewer system in the Pine Woods area there to make it easier to somebody to develop. It's hard to get a store because so many people shop online today. They use Amazon, and they think nothing of going on the internet. And the big box stores have eaten the little guys up. They really have. So it's hard to get a business, and we're doing our best to make it, Hyde Park appealing to them. But I think if we make it look better first, maybe it'll become more appealing. It certainly has a history going for it. It has tons of history, and we have a tremendous amount of tourists come here, but they don't stay. They come, they see the sights, and they leave. So, we just rezoned across the street of Hyde Park Motors to make it more friendly to put like townhouses in and stuff. But you got to get a developer, and it's easy. The old shopping center down the road. My brother Joe Malloy, I wasn't partnering on it, but he was partners with another fellow there, and then they both died. So the families own it, and can't get together or something, and it just sits there, and it's. I wish I could do something, but the only thing we can do is make it the infrastructure better. So if they sell it, or when it's for sale, but it would make it easier to develop. So that's the quandary we're in right now. To get we have a lot of taxes, a lot of properties on Hyde Park rolls, as you know, that are tax-free, the schools and the historic sites in the state. But it's also our strength, I mean, it really makes us different, or else we'd just be another river town. And to be the birthplace of FDR and the place he loved the most, that's saying something. He's going to go down as one of the best or top presidents ever. So even though there's some people around that don't like him, and a lot of Hyde Parkers didn't like him, and it's funny because it became like a history buff because of that, and because of meeting Mrs. Roosevelt and talking to her many times, I would realize what he did, and the people in town, they didn't like his politics, and they didn't vote for him. When he ran for president, he ran for 4 times, and he never carried Hyde Park. He did carry Hyde Park twice when he ran for New York State Senate. So he did carry the town those times. But president, no. And they would have the torchlight parade from the people in the village would march down with election night. I'm told this. I was too young. But, and we actually reenacted one a couple years ago. We didn't walk from here, but we walked down from the Wallace Center over to the front porch. And with the torchlight, and Bud Golden explained it. He was a kid then, and he, he participated in it. Or not a kid, he was old enough to know it. There's a picture of Elmer von Wagner, young Elmer, with Ike, his father. That's what we call his father, Ike, shaking hands with President Roosevelt on the 4th time he ran. He was pretty sick then, but on his front porch. So, and I think Elmer Jr. was 5 years older than me, so I just didn't have any memory of the president. But the history in town is incredible, and it was my wish, just because I grew up in it, that the school district would have some kind of a course that may be mandatory, that people really know what Hyde Park is about, really take ownership. A lot of people don't, if they're too young. They think Roosevelt was like, when I was a kid, I thought Washington and Lincoln were ancient, they weren't current at all. I mean, certainly were. I mean, we wouldn't be here without any of them. But just so they appreciate the town more, it was an active, live town. And their legacy lives on, I think, the Roosevelt legacy. Yes, they were liberal, but Mrs. Roosevelt was much more liberal than FDR was. FDR was much more practical as a politician. He was a very smart politician. But she was a wonderful woman, and the talks I had, and people in Hyde Park did not like her. Not a lot of people, don't get me wrong, not everybody, but she was called some terrible names when she was alive, and it's only in retrospect they realize, how what a wonderful person she was, and how if she was here right now, the most important person in the room would be you, and she'd be talking to you, and that's it. And I was just very lucky to have talked with her enough. And when we go to Roosevelt Estate on Memorial Day, it was a big day. Usually a politician would show up. And I shook hands with many of them, LBJ, JFK, Winston Churchill, pretty young. I was pretty young when he came. It had to be early 50s or late 40s, something like that. Just because I knew Bruce, I was there. you know, and it was just a thrill when you realize that Haile Selassie, Emperor Ethiopia, you know, Queen Juliana from the Netherlands. Yeah, it's incredible when you think back about it. You know, I can't think of it. Abraham's, you know, governor of New York, and just incredible. And you know, it's not that long ago. I mean, I'm old, but it's not. You know, I can remember it like yesterday. So I love the town. I always have, and I still love it. And yeah, it's got problems, so we can work on them. And the community came together then, and it can come together again. It's different. It's a different mix in Hyde Park now, and we have prejudice that exists, and we have to get over some of these. You know, as far as I'm concerned, this is a nation of immigrants. If my grandparents hadn't come over, I wouldn't be here. So there has to be some understanding and also some logic, you know. And when the laws are broken, interdiction has to be done. You can't get away scot-free. So some changes have to come. I don't want to get too political because that's not what it's about. This is about Dave in Hyde Park and how much I love it, and all the people I've met over the years. You know, it's just, I go over to the monument over here and at the town hall, and it goes back to World War One, and I knew many of those people. You know, as you know, living, talking, funny people. You know, and of course Vietnam, I knew all, most of them, and the Korean War, even the Korean War, because my brothers were involved in that, and you know, I know people got killed in them, and it really hurt. So Memorial Day coming up to me is not a big wahoo holiday. I remember those people who never saw life. They weren't able to live their life, but they gave their life so that we could have it. You know, the country could exist, survive, and has. And very grateful for that. So Memorial Day to me is not a whoopee-doo holiday. You know, it's one to reverence, and it's okay to have a picnic and that, yes, and celebrate their lives. Maybe I think that's what it should, celebrate their lives that they didn't live. But we lived ours because of them, is how I look at it. And it always chokes me up. And Aileen asked me to speak at the ceremony that the American Legion puts on right after the parade. Commander Thanos asked me to. She thought, yeah, to be out of town. Can you do it? I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And he called me, and I said, yes, absolutely. I don't know what I'm going to say, but it'll be personal. It's not going to be a canned speech, and it won't go on this long, folks. You know, it'll be all nodding off. So let's see. My kids. I didn't talk too much about my kids. I love them. Very proud of them. They're all gone. I mean, they're away now, except for Patrick's home. But I think of them all the time. And with Facebook, it's kind of neat because you keep in contact, even though the group in Florida, San Francisco, you know, and my daughter's close. She's Catskill. And there's another branch of the race in Catskill because my brother Bill married Zenecker from Poughkeepsie, Bernie Zenecker. They had their children. They lived on Albertson Street originally, and then he worked for Central Hudson and got transferred to Catskill. So a whole bunch of rays are over in Catskill now. And my daughter, it's funny how things work out. She's a librarian. She went to school and got her degree in library science in Pennsylvania, and Clarion University, and she worked at Dover Library, Dover, Delaware, and her mom was in a nursing home then, and she was pretty sick, so it was a long way. She didn't see her much, and she wanted to, and so she was looking for something up north, and the Catskill job opened up, and it was just, she fell into it. It was just meant to be. And my wife ended up in Ferncliff, up in Rhinebeck, and it was close, and it just worked out. It's funny, they didn't get along too well for most of their lives. They fought like cats and dogs, but they got together at the end, and I was just so grateful for that. You know, jeez.
I know that story.
Boy. Heck, chokes me up.
Does your daughter have children?
No. No. No, she's not married, but I don't think she will be now. But
you don't have any grandchildren, right?
I do.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, Mark has 2 children. They're in Florida, and I don't see them. Actually, one now has moved out of the house and lives in North or South Carolina. Manages a business there. And the 2 girls are still in Florida. in Pembroke Pines, which is near Fort Lauderdale. It's about 12 miles inland in the Everglades, you know. Been there, but don't see them that much, you know. I love them. Wish they were here. And they're going to move north because the girl he married is from Milwaukee or someplace. Or I don't think Milwaukee. No, Green Bay. Maybe Green Bay. She's a big Green Bay fan. So I guess that's where they're going to go when he retires. He's getting here. He's been a police officer for several years. He's got his retirement in, and he did a tour in Iraq, and then he came back to the police department, and they hired him as a patrolman, and he loves it. He was a detective. They said, well, you know, you want to be a patrolman? Oh, I'd love it. So that's what he does.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. And then Sean comes maybe once a year, flies east. I love to go there, but maybe I got a little more time. I love to go to San Francisco. I love that town. And my daughter and I went out there and really enjoyed it, seeing him. So they're far away, but they're my thoughts, you know. And it's, I've had a great life. You know,
I guess so.
I can bitch, but
Well, so
everybody has something. But on the whole, I'm just a very lucky person. Grateful that I've been brought up in this town. I really am. And to have known all the people I've known over the years. It's just, I'm connected. That's the only thing I can say. I'm just connected. So I don't know what else is. I'm retired now, so I work 1 day a week.
That's it?
1 day a week in pharmacy. Just keep my hand in. But and I enjoy being on town board very much and trying to help people as much as I can. And that's what I'll continue to do. If they don't like it, show me out. Well, that's about it, I think. I don't know.
Oh, I'm just looking at my questions
Yeah, all
here.
right.
And the only two questions I can look at here and ask you is, what life event stands out most in your memory?
There's two, actually. One was when I was 9 or 10 years old. I almost had my right hand severed in a car accident down by Lehan's house on River Road. Got crushed between a car door and a tree, and my sister was driving, and anyway, came up River Hill we went to Dr. Hurst, but Dr. Locke was closer because we were at the top of the hill here. Went in there, and Dr. Locke took me right in, did the initial work, threw me in his car, went up to Northern Dutchess Hospital at 100 miles an hour or whatever on the old Route 9. It wasn't the 4-lane or anything. We had no ambulance in town. And my father, later I found out, was active in getting an ambulance for the Hyde Park Fire Department. I think maybe because of that, I don't know, but Mr. Cantor in Poughkeepsie owned a car dealership, and he donated an old Packard, to Hyde Park. And actually there's a picture of me on the wall in the Hyde Park Fire Department with my father, Al Overfield, Juice Farley, and me with the new ambulance, which was an old Packard. But we had an ambulance, so that was tragic. I had many, many operations. They saved the hand, and I have some use, a pretty good use out of it. And the second, the biggest one was the Malloy fire, without a doubt. When I lost my niece, Therese, I now have another niece, one of their daughter's kids named Therese, and I couldn't say that name for so long because I thought of she was a little over 2 years old. She used to swing on my arm, and it's the only one they couldn't get out of the house. They rescued. My sister was carrying them, I think. She remembers having 3 kids in her arms trying to get to the window, to the firemen, and Therese somehow either slipped out, who knows. I mean, it was a terrible night, and by the time the firemen got her, she had expired. So it was, and the other kids got burned, but they all survived.
They had several children, right?
Oh, they had 8 or 9, yeah, 9, I guess, and yeah, they lost Therese. So that, I mean, just like yesterday, it's just like yesterday. Now I had a lot of other things that happened. Friends died and stuff, but those two, Ricky Trani getting killed in Vietnam was a big one too, big one. We were friends, and that really hit home. But those two, my hand, because I was just 9 years old, 10 years old, and well, no matter when you are, it's gonna hurt. And then of course the fire, the Malloy fire. Joe Malloy was out of town. He was hunting or fishing in Canada with his brother-in-law, and Charlotte was alone, so they all came to my house, and it's just,
It must have been awful.
but the Hyde Park Fire Department, I'll never forget the job they did. Unbelievable.
Somebody told me the story about that's why the balcony is outside on that house now.
Absolutely. When they decided to rebuild at the same location because of the historic nature. They loved the spot. So John Golden actually built the house. Charlotte found the plans in one of these magazines, and they wanted to make sure there was an exit for every bedroom, every room actually, especially upstairs. So the balcony goes all around.
Yeah.
And I stayed there many nights, and you can just go out on the balcony. You can use it, but you can get down, and the stairs lead down because they, in the fire, they couldn't. They had to go out the window. And I think that building, the original one, might have been 3 stories. They didn't use upstairs much, but they were on the second floor where all the bedrooms were. Yeah, that's definitely why that railing is put there.
Makes it perfect for a bed and breakfast.
It does. I forgot all about that, till you mention it, and as soon as you mention it, yeah, absolutely, that's what they did it for. They were looking for that.
It worked out
And
well.
Golden put the house up as fast as he could, it was just amazing, the cooperation and how the whole town, and at Regina Coeli they have a little, there's like a chapel, not a chapel, I don't know what you call it, a little area there, up to the left of the altar. It's called the Children's Memorial, something. It was started for Therese, my niece, and now I guess all children. They have you can light a candle or something. It's nice.
It's interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
Other question I got is
Yeah.
what local event affected you most?
Well, they were both local.
Well, yeah.
Uh,
Was there anything else? I know the war ending. I would think that would
that
be
was
a
my
huge
first
one.
memory, because I was pretty young.
But that's huge.
I didn't know what it was about really, but I knew everybody was happy, so I was happy, and that was huge. But I as far as beat Japan or Germany, I have no idea what it was. I didn't know. I had no idea. Biggest event, I don't know. My father died when I was 13. That was big, My friend Bruce died when he was like 22.
Oh.
That was big. He lived right here. He used to own this building next door. Sereno, where Sereno has the realty. Bruce and I own that building, and he lived upstairs, and he died 21 or 22 of appendicitis, of all things,
Wow. Well, that's
Yeah,
okay. You don't
big
have to.
diagnosis. But as far as, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt's funeral, that was a historic
Oh, yeah, I
thing. I
remember
was here
that.
for that, but I wasn't able to get on the estate. But Doug McGowan, he was, because he invited and tell me all about it. But they came by here, and I'll never forget. It wasn't a joyous event, but Eisenhower was at the window with a big grin, smiling, waving. That's what I remember. But I saw Kennedy and Eisenhower and Truman,
Yeah.
Rockefellers, a bunch of them here. Hadley Stevenson was here. That was a huge event, but it was like history.
Yeah.
But she lived in Walkill. She wasn't living here. I was like, she come visit people. When I knew her, I didn't know she lived here.
She was our neighbor by then.
Yeah,
She was one of the East Parkers.
East Parker. But she shopped the Grand Union here at Hyde Park. So she came in my boys too, and I waited on her. Joe used to say, she used to buy cigarettes. And either she'd buy them or Tubby Kearney come and buy them for her. She had a charge account, Charging Mrs. R, okay. And he'd yell out, don't give her any matches. So I guess if you bought a carton, they were cheaper than buying a pack at a time. And Joe didn't want to give matches out if she bought a carton. All right, okay. We go, here, Mrs. R. Oh, thank you, she'd say.
I didn't know she smoked.
Oh, yeah. She did. Everybody did back then, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah. And she charged him. She had a charge account. Mrs. R. She put on a slip. Small town.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I never saw her. I don't know.
Really?
Yeah.
She died in 62.
Yeah. Yeah, because I remember we stood at the gate and watched people come in.
On the funeral?
For the funeral.
Oh, okay. Why wouldn't... Oh, well, you're younger than me, that's why.
Just a little. Not that much.
Well, I used to meet her on the train, too. Coming from the city when I went to Fordham. She would get on the 440 out of New York at night. She'd be down there all weekend, come on the weekend, take the train by herself. And a lot of times the seat next to her would be empty because either people, the old lady, didn't want to bother her, they didn't know who she was, or they knew who she was. I'd sat there several times with her. Anybody here, Mrs. R? Is John here? Oh, he's up in the club car, or whatever, you know. Oh, sit down, sit down. And she usually would nod off, but we'd have a conversation, so she did. I'll never forget the one she had with me. She was reading the New York Post, and at the time that was a very my father called it a pinko rag, but today it's very conservative. But it wasn't that; it was quite liberal. And she's reading the article, and it said it had to be 1960 or something like that. That Germany was going to have a small armed forces again, for internal reasons. And she said out loud, "I shudder to think only 15 years ago what we had to do to stop them, and they're going to rearm them." I'll never forget that statement. Just made out loud. I was sitting there with him. I said, "Oh, really?" To me, 60, and it was ancient history, but it was only 1945. 15 years. And she was right. And thank God there hasn't been another war with them. That was a statement I'll never forget. And she was like, whew. She really took it. And I can see why.
She's a fascinating person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Loved her.
I like her.
Yep.
Yeah.
She's my heroine.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, number one person. Not FDR, not any president, her.
I think a lot of people felt that way.
Yeah, well, maybe because I, got to meet her, and I don't know, but, that made it really personal. So
she was so involved.
Boy, she was terrific. She had her prejudices, too, though, but as we all do. She didn't want JFK in the White House. She thought that the Pope would be running the country. A lot of people did. And he had a talk with her. I read it in a book. This is nothing I heard, but he met her at Valkill, and Peter Salinger was his press secretary. And after he came out of the meeting, an hour meeting with Mrs. R, and he said, "How did it go?" And Kennedy said to Pierre, "I am smitten." JFK, the Playboy president almost, and he blew her away. She blew him away. So, and she endorsed him too.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You go over the Valkill, and it doesn't look like a president's wife lives there.
No, I loved it. I used to swim over there, and when the pool was open, and we were out some wild. Charlotte would bring me over with Ann Clay, Ann Dingy now.
We interviewed her.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, I would luck out and go over with them. I was their little brother tagging along.
She was great.
Yeah, and I remember in the pool, and I was young. This woman dives in. I said to myself, "Who's that old lady?" She's a good dive, too. It was Eleanor. She learned how to swim. But I remember swimming in that pool. It's covered now.
Yeah.
But that's how Hyde Park was. Everybody had friends, and you just went. And she was truly a resident here. I mean, just a regular resident. Ah.
Well, you did a good job.
Did I?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
glad to do it. I keep bugging people to do theirs,
I know you do. You're a good help.
So I figured I better do it.
I wanted to add that we are in the museum, the Town of Hyde Park Historical Society Museum, and that's where we're doing this oral history.
Oh, wow.
And there he goes, panning the museum.
But that voting booth is amazing right behind... well, you
Get
probably
the camera back
can't,
there.
but I
Come
mean,
on, you can do it.
that's the 1932 election when Herbert Hoover ran against FDR. There's a picture of them using that machine. It's like, it's just incredible. And their names are still on there, It's like, God, they were lucky to get that.
You did a great job.
Did I?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, I love when people just start talking. Boop, 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 boop.
Yeah, well,
And that's it.
I was scatterbrained at times.
No, you did great.
Bounce around.
You sure had an interesting childhood.
Yeah, I did. It was idyllic, really, when you think of it.
Yeah.
It's almost like Tom Sawyer.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A great technician. I hope it comes
Turn that
out.
off now.
I hope it comes out. I'll have to do it over.